Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Maddie. I'll be your host for today's webinar on fact or fiction, the portrayal of warnings in film and documentaries. So today we've got three brilliant speakers with us. We have Professor Alexa von Mossner, who is an associate professor at the University of Klagenfurt. Very sorry if I mispronounced your name there, Alexa. And then we've got Professor Deborah Dixon, who is a professor at the University of Glasgow, and John Carr, who is a professor at Northwest Missouri State University. So just before we get into the webinar, I'm going to pass along to Carina, who is the director of the Warning Research Centre, who's going to tell us a bit more about what the centre actually does.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are delighted that you've joined us for this very exciting webinar. I am just going to pull up a slide just to give a little bit of an introduction about who we are and what we're up to, and give a bit of an introduction to this webinar. So here we go. Hopefully this will work. And I'm hoping that you guys can see our slides there. Brilliant. So hello, yes, welcome everyone from around the world. We're so delighted that you're with us. Of course, one of the most positive things that's come out of the global pandemic has been the capability for us to engage with our global community, which we love to do via the internet. And we know that warnings are a fairly bespoke interest, and so we're really glad that we're able to welcome everyone who has an interest in it, particularly in films and documentaries today. So welcome very much. My name is Dr. Carina Fearnley. I'm director of the UCL Warning Research Centre, and I just wanted to take a couple of minutes just to tell you a little bit about what we do and a little bit about the event today. So we are the first dedicated warning research centre that was set up to look at both natural and human-made hazards. And so what we want to do is bring together expertise around natural and human-made hazards and look at these across a range of different disciplines, organisations and institutions, geography and social livelihood contexts. So, for example, what could we learn from the Chernobyl meltdown that might be useful for volcanoes? What can we learn from tsunamis that might be useful for tornadoes? So these kind of ideas might seem a little bit remote, but there are some commonalities around warnings and alerts and the representation of them, which we'll be focusing on today. And that's what this centre is trying to do. So we're really cutting across knowledge and really trying to look at warnings in a way that hasn't been done before. We are globally unique as a research centre dedicated to warning knowledge. We have 27 core members across University College London here in the UK, and we have 28 affiliates that are based all over the globe who are experts working in warnings. And these can be academics or practitioners or in various institutions as well. And what we want to do as a centre is create a centre of excellence around warnings so that we can bring together the best knowledge and expertise globally around warnings, but provide that community as well for both researchers and practitioners to share their ideas or their problems and issues of which they need solutions for. And as part of that, as a centre, we want to make sure that we provide research expertise, teaching excellence, policy advice, and engagement with the public, which is very much at the heart of today's webinar. So we all want to support the UN's initiatives with the Sendai framework that firmly has warnings on the agenda, and the same is with UNESCO. There's talk around warnings in terms of the new pandemic warning treaty that's being put in place. So we know that this is a really important topic, and we're here to help support that topic. Now, we've been pretty busy so far. We've had a few grants who've been working on our webinar series. We've been doing some news events and working with the House of Lords here in the UK, providing some evidence. And we've recently published a report by the UK National Preparedness Commission, which is on enhancing warning. So please do take a look at that report and let us know if you've got any questions. And we also have been offering some training courses, which is brilliant, to our wonderful folk, the NGO Doctors with Africa, Quake. So you can find out more about us on this website here, our web link here, but we've also got a lot of social media. So we share all sorts of news and stories around Twitter, around warnings on Twitter. We have our LinkedIn and Facebook page, and we also have a YouTube page. And on that YouTube page are all of our webinars, including today's, which will be uploaded in a couple of days for you to view again and have a look at and make notes or look over the slides or whatever you want to do. So today what we're focusing on is factual fiction, the portrayal of warnings in film and documentaries. And this is very timely because we've seen the release of the Netflix film, Don't Look Up, which has created a lot of media attention. And I'm pretty sure many of our speakers today will be referring to that going forward. But I was particularly excited when I watched this, because essentially the film is about a warning. It's about scientists giving a warning to the public and saying, you guys need to do something about this. And just the whole complex unraveling of how society responds. I don't want to spoil it for anyone that hasn't seen it, and I do recommend you see it if you're interested. And it's just a great film because in many ways it does bring together many of the dynamics of warnings around acting on warnings, believing warnings, disaster fatigue, if you like. We've got a lot of imminent crisis on our dashboard right now with climate change, various wars around the world, and we've got all sorts of different issues that are going on and popping up, pandemic and so on. So it is this issue of how can we cut through that all, especially if we're talking about an issue that's to a global community like they're talking about and Don't Look Up. So it's a real challenge, and it comes to the heart of how do we communicate warnings and risks to the public, to key decision makers as well, and in a way that makes the warning effective, i.e. we do something about it before it's too late. And of course, we've seen lots of warnings in film and popular media. There's some listed on the side here of some of my favourite disaster movies here. Obviously, Contagion has been a recent favourite following the pandemic. But these movies are brilliant in a way that they help us imagine a disaster. They help people get their head around what would it look like if we had a pandemic or a volcanic eruption. Or sometimes the films like The Impossible are trying to portray real events, maybe from the perspective of the Western tourists that are there, or sometimes from the perspective of the local communities. It really helps us to consider unlikely scenarios that are so different from our everyday life, and that's really important. But questions that come about in terms of disaster movie film representation are about the accuracy of it. And here I've got a classic picture here in Dante's Peak, one of my favourite, of a car driving over lava. And of course, you don't need to be a volcano expert to know that that's impossible. But what's really important, though, is to know that actually this film was based on true events, and it was done with a huge consultation with the United States Geological Survey. And so actually it's an incredibly accurate film that really captures a lot of very real nuances, apart from this one little incident of the lava flow, because at the end of the day, we still need to have some excitement and drama. So we're going to be looking today about what we can learn about narratives around warning stories. We're also going to be looking at documentaries as well as films, and how we can engage and excite and educate the public and raise awareness of the value and role of warnings, both globally and institutionally. And you can see on this screen, we've got a number of different documentaries. So on the left here, we've got Understanding Volcanic Hazard Risks. This video was used to save quite literally hundreds of thousands of people's lives when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines in 1991. We've got a wonderful film here by Spike Lee, When the Levees Broke, that represented the black perspective of the Hurricane Katrina that happened in 2008. And then we've got some here, some docudramas of Challenger and Chernobyl, obviously events that actually happened. BBC documentary Supervolcano, looking forward as to what would happen if Yellowstone, the supervolcano, would erupt. And then we have our wonderful Sir David Attenborough, who's been looking at extinction, again, trying to warn the public. What do we need to do? What is on the horizon? So it's a really exciting topic today. I'm really excited to have such wonderful speakers with us today. So I'll hand over to Maddie to get the session started. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Carina. And I'm just going to start with a brief presentation on warnings in film. So I'm going to be mainly touching upon two aspects of warnings in film, which are imagination and engaging the public. And then I'll go on to talk a bit about each of the speakers that we have here today. So the topics I'm going to cover are imagining disaster, engaging the public, and the relationship between film and warnings. So this quote by Kearney tells us how imagination engages the human power to connote absence into presence, actuality into possibility, and what is into something other than it is. And imagination plays a vital role in shaping our perceptions of the world and the different events that unfold within it. And some even believe that the lack of public reaction to crises such as the current climate crisis could be due to a lack of public imagination. And film, varying from depictions of natural disasters, diseases, zombies, asteroids, sharknadoes, like these visual accounts of disaster, whether fictional or non-fictional, can really help to trigger the imagination of the public and engage them. And the zombie genre, which is one of my favourite genres, is actually a really effective, a really good example of how film can engage the public. And the genre taps into anxiety surrounding a multitude of hazards, such as disease and ideas concerning self within a pandemic, and also even touches upon aspects of terrorism, specifically bioterrorism, as within some of these films, the disease that starts the outbreak itself is actually being manufactured by governments or secret organisations. And this kind of helps us to work through anxieties surrounding bioterrorism and chemical attacks. Oh, sorry. So the zombie genre is so popular as well that the CDC even utilised it in a number of promotional health campaigns in which they detailed how to prepare in the event of a disease outbreak and how to prepare for different types of emergencies. And they kind of advertised this as a zombie preparedness plan. So I just think it's really interesting that even these organisations like the CDC find value in using imagination to engage the public. And the disaster genre can transport the audience to a place where their anxieties and uncertainties around hazards can be explored. And as film itself is a process which shapes different social and cultural ideas and relationships, it makes sense that we should start to consider film in relation to different warnings and hazards. So the popularity of the 2011 film Contagion during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic just is a good example of how people turn to film in order to understand current events unfolding in real life. So for those who haven't seen it, the film follows the experiences and actions of different members of government, of scientists, and members of the public as they react to a new deadly infectious disease. And people turn to Contagion as a way to ease their anxiety and confusion as reality almost began to mirror the plot of the film. And I've got a picture of Sir David Attenborough here as well, as Carina said. And David Attenborough's documentaries, such as his 2020 film A Life on Our Planet, which discusses global warming, and the extreme popularity of them and him as a public figure also demonstrate how effective film and documentaries are at engaging the public in relation to environmental issues and climate change. So effective warning systems should essentially keep people and communities at the centre of them. And one way to prompt more engagement and understanding could be through film, which is the point of this webinar. And as Carina also discussed, Don't Look Up is a good example of how film can start discussions and inspire people. And although the film received mixed reviews, and I'm sure some of you love it and some of you hate it, it was nominated for several Oscars, and it did inspire a climate march in France, during which people held up signs which just simply stated "Look Up." And Don't Look Up also demonstrates how people are hesitant to react to crisis. So if you haven't seen it, I won't spoil anything, but the film follows two scientists as they try to warn the public about an asteroid that's headed towards Earth. And this actually serves as a metaphor in real life for climate change. And within the film, we see the divide in society between those who choose to look up and acknowledge the situation and those who don't. And this is similar to how we function as a society, as for some people, acknowledging the warnings about emergencies like climate change means that there has to be radical changes in how we operate as a society, which can conflict with different individual value and belief systems and capitalist ideas. So overall, though there is the risk of misinformation within these fictional films, they can still enable discussion and inspire further thought and imagination amongst the public. And they can be extremely helpful in conveying important social, political, and environmental messages in a way that's accessible and understandable to the public. So I'm going to discuss a really good example of the integration of warnings into film, which is public information films. And these were extremely popular in Britain between the 1960s and 70s. And they dealt with a variety of issues and disasters such as war, disease, water safety, road safety, and the idea of stranger danger. And I don't know if it's a popular saying outside of the UK, but if you've ever heard somebody say coughs and sneezes spread diseases, that actually originated in public information films about the spread of disease. And although some of these films did act as propaganda during the First and Second World War, other ones were extremely effective in engaging the imagination of the public and conveying issues in a way which was understandable for those of all ages. So Protect and Survive is one of the more famous examples of public information campaigns, and it was a mini-series on how to know if a nuclear attack was about to happen and what to do before, during, and after the attack. And I'm just going to show a short video, which is the first in the series of Protect and Survive. This talks about what a nuclear blast actually entails. I'll just need to make sure that the sound plays. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Nuclear explosions are caused by weapons such as H-bombs or atom bombs. They are like ordinary explosions, only many times more powerful. They cause great heat and blast. They also make a cloud of deadly dust, which falls slowly to the ground. This is what is called fallout. So these are the two dangers. First, heat and blast, which is followed by fallout. The heat and blast is so severe that it can kill and can destroy buildings for up to 5 miles from the explosion. Fallout is dust that is sucked up from the ground by the explosion. It can be deadly dangerous. It rises high in the air and can be carried by winds for hundreds of miles before falling to the ground. You can protect yourself and your family, and later on we will show you what steps to take.
So that was an example of what these kind of films were like and how they conveyed messages and educated the public in a way that was engaging and didn't use overly complicated language in order to ensure that the message was clearly getting across. So overall, I wanted to convey the importance of imagination and engagement within public understanding of disasters and how their accompanying warnings and how integrating film into disaster research and warnings could be beneficial. So thanks for listening to me go on, and I'm going to introduce the speakers now. So first we have Alexa, and she's an associate professor of American Studies at the University of Klagenfurt, and her research explores contemporary environmental culture from a cognitive ecocritical perspective and climate change narratives across a variety of media. And her talk today is titled Filming at the 11th Hour, Environmental Documentaries as Warnings. And next we have Deborah Dixon, who is a professor at the University of Glasgow, and she's an internationally recognised scholar in feminist geopolitics and has been key to the emergence of geohumanities as an interdisciplinary field of research and practice. And she was also one of the main figures in integrating more consideration of film into geography as a subject. And her talk today will be titled Animating the Sublime Between Horror and Control. And last but not least, we've got John Carr, who is a professor and programme coordinator for emergency and disaster management at Northwest Missouri State University. And his research includes citizen engagement in emergency management education, and the influence of disaster movies on the public's perception of disasters and related operations. And today he'll be discussing the representation of warnings and disaster management in disaster movies and what the long-term impact of this influence may be according to science education research. So I'm just going to move on now to Alexa, if you're ready.
Yes, thank you very much. Maddie, can you hear me okay? Does that work well? Yeah. Well, thanks very much to you, Maddie and Carina, for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to join the panel with Deborah and John. It's an honor. I'm really glad to be here. Let me share my screen and then I will begin. So does this work? See this? Okay. All right, so as Maddie has already pointed out, I'm going to look mostly at documentary films today, which has been one of my research foci over the past 10 years or so. I also look at a lot of fiction films, but I found it interesting in the context of this webinar to look at environmental documentaries. And so I want to pick up on something that both Carina and Maddie pointed out, and that is this problem that we are usually encountering when people are asked to imagine the future or future outcomes of something of their current practices. So as you can see here, this is the psychologist Jamil Saki, who writes that deeply empathic people tend to be environmentally responsible, but our caring instincts are short-sighted and dissolve across space and time, making it harder for us to deal with things that haven't happened yet. So this is about this crisis of imagination that was mentioned earlier. And the hope has often been, as has also been expressed by both Maddie and Carina, that vivid and engaging storytelling can address this problem because it can serve as an effective and thus effective warning. So there is this emphasis on engaging viewers or readers' imagination in our topic today, viewers' imaginations, and engaging them emotionally, and that will be then more effective than just telling people, you know, there is a problem here and hey, you should be careful. So this is just you know, just a small selection of the films that I have been looking at. I've also curated a film series, an environmental documentary series in Munich for several years. So in the upper row, you see these are all the climate change documentaries. And then in the lower, you see, you know, films on extinction, on overfishing, on seeds and GMO food, on fracking, on meat consumption and climate change. And all of these films try to do precisely what we've been talking about. They try to engage viewers' imagination and their emotions. And I would argue that one reason why they look so different from, for example, these public information films has been, you know, there have at least been two important influences. And I would say one of those is Michael Moore, because Michael Moore really has shown, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, what you can do with a documentary, how it can look totally different. And he did win with Bowling for Columbine. It came out in 2002. It won, you know, it was not only a major commercial success, but it won an Academy Award. And some people hate it more, I guess still hate him today. Some people just love his style. But one thing that he told other documentary filmmakers was the first rule of documentaries is don't make a documentary, make a movie. Right? And so what does he mean by that? Make a movie. And this is his explanation. If you make a movie, people might actually go see your documentary. They don't care whether you make them cry, whether you make them laugh, whether you even challenge them to think, but damn it, they don't want to be lectured. They don't want to see our invisible wagging finger popping out of the screen. They want to be entertained, right? So that's his point, and that's what he has been, of course, doing in all of his own documentary films. He's trying to entertain you and maybe get you enraged, maybe make you laugh, or both, ideally. And all of these films, in different ways, I would argue very much have tried to make movies in this sense, right? They're often also very often a cinema released. And in some cases, like here in the on the right lower side, Gasland and Cowspiracy arguably even use the same structure as Michael Moore's films. You have the filmmaker in the film and kind of as an investigator who's trying to figure out what the heck is going on. There has been a second influence. I want to zoom in on climate change documentaries for the rest of climate change films for the rest of my talk. And for those, another big influence, this has also been mentioned twice, was definitely The Day After Tomorrow, which came out just 2 years after Bowling for Columbine and was arguably the first major Hollywood movie to really deal with climate change. And that film, of course, we will hear much more about disaster movies later on, but this was really, this is a science fiction, dystopian science fiction, but it was also a disaster movie at heart. And you do have all these typical components. You have a scientist at the beginning of it warn the public that something terrible is going to happen. As you see it here in the background, he's warning the UN and the American government here that the Atlantic conveyor belt is going to stall and that there will be another ice age because of climate change. And he's repeating that later on in the film when he tells the American government that now it's too late, that he draws a line here through the map, and then he says people below that line can be evacuated, need to be evacuated. For the rest, it is actually too late. So it's again a warning, but also already telling them, you didn't heed earlier warnings, so now it's actually too late. And then the disasters, of course, start because this is the genre of the film, and you do get this new ice age, and New York looks like this at the end. But the important thing when we think about emotional engagement and disaster films is, of course, yes, they do cue negative emotions. That's this part what makes them exciting. But they also always, as Carl Plantinga, the film scholar, has argued, they balance that with what he calls positive payoff emotions, right? These films, they're also making you, they're exciting, they make you curious, there are all kinds of positive emotions. You root for a character. The film has been very scientifically inaccurate, as we all know, those of us who know the film, but also, the boy gets the girl and the father and the son are reunited. So even though it is actually a disaster at the very end, there are positive emotions, which, makes this film enjoyable. And so there have been a number of studies on this film, how audiences reacted to it, and it did, Anthony Leiserowitz and others have shown that it actually did influence people's climate risk perceptions, that it had an impact. Then perhaps, most interestingly, it was actually used by then UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon as an example. He wrote, he said, the scenarios outlined in the 2007 IPCC report are as frightening as a science fiction movie, but they are even more terrifying because they are real. So he's actually referring to The Day After Tomorrow in order to describe, in order to make people understand what the new IPCC report released after the film, what it actually contains. So it's a form of science communication. And the film has been used, Micah Swoboda has shown this, the film continued to be used for a decade in science communication, actually. And even this is just from last year, when Nicholas Burrs published an article in Nature Climate Change called Observation-Based Early Warning Signals for Collapse of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And sure enough, that was picked up by a number of news outlets in the way you see on the right side. Scientists says the plot for The Day After Tomorrow is actually happening, right? So because it's kind of a shortcut, it helps people imagine immediately what this might mean when they are writing about the results of a scientific article. So in that way, disaster movies have been used as warnings. So there are warnings in the film, but it's also being used as a warning or to make a warning more visceral. And these climate change documentary often do something very similar. They use warnings and they use dystopian storytelling. So one example is here, An Inconvenient Truth, starring Al Gore, which has this, even the visual warnings as he actually speaks about what's going to happen. Also, those of you who have seen the film, which by the way was not only released 2 years after The Day After Tomorrow, but contains actual footage from The Day After Tomorrow as a documentary. But you also have this in the film. Let me just show you a little bit of this, which is a computer animation, what will happen to sea levels, right? And so that again is a warning where he looks into the future. So this is basically using a very simple dystopian story element in order to show people what will happen, help them imagine, right? Then in 2 films in which Leonardo DiCaprio has involved in, another example of how documentary and Hollywood feature films is intertwined. The 11th Hour and Before the Flood are also films that are using, at least post-apocalyptic images, that are supposed to show the future. And The 11th Hour was criticized, one of the earlier films, for what did it have? It had a lot of talking head scientists who would say, this is going to be really bad. And it was supposed to be, the critics said it was overwhelming. This is too much, right? To just have these warnings after warnings after warnings. Another interesting film in that context is The Age of Stupid, because that is a film by the British filmmaker Armstrong, who actually uses a dystopian, Franny Armstrong, I'm sorry, who's actually using a dystopian framework for a documentary film. You see it here on the right side. This is London in the year 2055, where basically there are no humans on Earth anymore. Everybody has died because the biosphere has collapsed due to climate change. And you have the late Pete Postlethwaite as an actor playing supposedly the last surviving human in the future, who is literally warning, and kind of the clue of this film as he speaks here to the audience and looks at you directly is he has kind of 2 audiences. One is he talks to you because he's one of us in the future, saying, we were so stupid in the age of stupid because we should have heeded the warnings. But he was also recording this for alien cultures, and sends it to space at the end so that they will be warned not to repeat humanity's mistakes, right? So, but the actual film then is a documentary film, but it was framed that way. And interesting enough, it was framed that way because they screened an early version of the film that did not have that dystopian framing. And people got confused because it was a lot of storylines and they couldn't really follow. And then they came up with this framing device, and that was then really successful. So, but this kind of approach has not been without criticism. So the criticism has been that, this focus on on warnings and on these dark scenarios is counterproductively hopeless and doomist. There are no positive payoff emotions as there would be in a fiction film. There are no options to act, or at least only very reduced, usually at the end of the film. And then the claim has often been that this is problematic because it leads to apathy, and that a focus on hope and solutions would be needed. And so there are 2 things I want to say about that briefly. One is that it is more complicated because if you look at The Age of Stupid, Rachel Howell, for example, has shown that actually it's more complex because the suspected negative and depolitical effect of disaster narratives largely does not appear to have happened in this case when she did an empirical reception study in the UK. So, but she actually found that the people felt more empowered and more encouraged to do something in their lives. So it's not as easy, that negative emotions, cueing negative emotions is always a problem because emotions also drive actions. But she also had a follow-up study that showed that the effect weakens over time, we can maybe talk about that because that's also a common insight, that effects that are cued by films actually weaken very quickly. And so people like Chapman and Lickel and Markowitz have said, you know, we need to reassess emotion and climate change communication because it's actually much more complicated than people sometimes think it is. And I want to look at this film very briefly. These are two films, but I only want to look at one of them, Demain, which is a French film, and 2040, by Damon Gameau, which is an Australian film, which both try to do something different. They're also issuing warnings about climate change, but they combine that with a turn towards the utopian, hopeful, and desirable. So they turn away from the dystopian disaster narratives in combination with their warnings. They turn to small-scale community projects, existing technical solutions that could be expanded. That's what they are interested in. And Gameau has explained that his film is meant to be an antidote to the all doom and gloom dystopian narratives about the future that we find at the moment. Just felt like there's another option. We don't have to just march blindly into that future, that it's important to throw up different visions of the future, and especially around the climate, which feels a bit helpless at the moment, and people don't know what to do. So that's what he, that's what he does in his film. And he does it again with a framing story that's fictitious. So in the dystopian part, he films his daughter, who's 4 years old, and then that the same girl is played in the future by an actress, and he plays himself in the documentary portion, and he plays an older version of himself in the future of the film. But the interesting thing is that this is a utopian future. You see that here, the greening of the overpasses, of the roofs, reforestation projects. So he tries, there is another dimension here, and you have the daughter at the end. You don't have an old man who's desperate asking you, what did we do? But you have a girl, in the future, what were you guys thinking? But it has been turned around in that future. So it still contains both explicit and implicit warning, but they are framed differently and put in a different effective context. So there is hope and desire in addition to fear and guilt. And I think that's something we should think about, right? And not that one is better than the other, but that there are more options perhaps. And so this is my last slide, that to remind us, as David Roberts has done, that any effective response will fade without reinforcement, that these experiences need to repeat it over and over again before they stick, right? As with warnings, and we just don't know what kind of downstream effects an emotional experience will have, meaning, maybe in 5 years and 10 years, there will still be an effect of something that you saw yesterday in a movie theater, right? So that makes it difficult to measure, but it also makes us a bit more hopeful. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alexa. Oh, thank you very much, Alexa. That was really interesting. I'll need to check out some of the films that you mentioned in that. So now we're going to move on to Deborah, if you're ready.
Oh, thank you, Maddie. And what I'm just going to do is share screen and set that up. So, okay, brilliant. So, Maddie, is that just showing okay? Great. Well, to begin, what a great talk from Alexa. And as I was listening, I was thinking, actually, this is going to be quite complementary in many ways. And what I'm going to do, which is unusual for me, is talk from slides. And I'm going to focus in on the sublime. And my big sort of starting idea in terms of understanding disasters is that, yes, of course, extreme events, whether it be earthquakes, fires, tsunamis, etc., when combined with people made vulnerable, produce disasters. And we know that those disasters have tremendous impacts on people wide and far, and it reshapes social relations, it reshapes cultures. But at the same time, cultural forms such as discourse have a tremendous impact upon how those events and disasters are framed and made sense of, including scientific explanations, including science communication, and including warnings. Now, I think one of the key discourses that comes into play when we try to apprehend and understand disaster is the sublime. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to say more about what the sublime is. And very sort of basically, it's a way of thinking and feeling that emphasizes the ultimate fragility of individual people, but also society more broadly in the face of an uncaring and perverse nature. And it's that inhuman nature that becomes apparent to us in what we think and feel to be this sweeping force of natural hazards and extreme events. There's a lot to be said about the sublime as a concept, as an aesthetic, but I'm just going to highlight a few sort of thinkers to help unpack this idea of the sublime. And I'm just going to look at the European tradition here. And I'll start with the politician and philosopher Edmund Burke, writing about the sublime as whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects. And what I like about Burke is that his commentary really emphasizes the embodied feeling of the sublime. And he writes, for example, the passion caused by the great and sublime in nature is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. The mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. So it gives you that sense of being really not just taken aback, but brought to a standstill in the face of the sublime. Samuel Johnson, the writer and diarist, also talks about the sublime. And what he brings is a really useful idea of scale here between the infinite cosmos and the tiny little insignificant human being. So in one of his commentaries where he's traveling through North Wales, he writes, it excels Dovedale by the extent of its prospects, the awfulness of its shades, the horrors of its precipices, the verdures, which just means greenness, of its hollows, and the loftiness of its rocks. The ideas which it forces upon the mind are the sublime, the dreadful, and the vast. Above is inaccessible altitude, below horrible profundity. But perhaps the most famous writer on the sublime from that European tradition is the philosopher and teacher of geography, Emmanuel Kant. And it's Kant who says, yes, the sublime results from an apprehension of a thing's limitlessness, yet with a superadded thought of its totality. And through that, we come to feel our tiny, insignificant place in nature. And yet, he writes, and this is important, that perception is itself proof of a human uniqueness. And it says something about our capacity as human beings that we can apprehend and imagine the sublime itself. And he says the sublime is a very sort of pervasive way of thinking about landscapes, because it gives value to scenes that we find complex or threatening or difficult to interpret, such as colonized landscapes. I just wanted to add here that the historian, Barbara M. Stafford, makes the argument that it's colonialism, and especially the disseminating role of scientific travelers like Humboldt, that plays an important role in developing this sublime aesthetic. explaining non-Western landscapes. Now, we see that sublime aesthetic coming out in a European as well as North American tradition of art and poetry, the humanities. And a great example here is Thomas Cole's painting, Notch of the White Mountains, where he basically commemorates a landslide which comes down through the pass. It doesn't touch at all the tiny little inn at the bottom of the pass, but it kills the family who are fleeing the inn. And he's commemorating this as a sublime event. It shows you that inhuman, fundamentally perverse side of nature. Now, just as Thomas Cole uses the framing device of the canvas to give you that event, so disaster films like The Perfect Storm give you that same sense of a sweeping nature. And I'm sure many of you will have seen the film The Perfect Storm. And not to give too much of a spoiler, but yes, everyone does die. And it's based on a book, which is in turn based on a true story, which brings together a meteorological history where we see this, immense sort of surveillance and knowledge dissemination apparatus being set up to monitor climate and weather systems. We see the intersection of that with the personal struggle of fishermen against this freak storm event. And just as Thomas Cole's trying to give you a sense of the immensity of nature through the painting, so the film gives you this sense of the immensity, the inhumanness of nature through this gigantic wave which swamps our protagonists. So both thoroughly in the sublime disaster genre. Now, what I want to emphasize at this point is that the sublime is a fundamentally conservative understanding of disaster, because what it's doing is positioning people as passive spectators of disaster, watching it unfold, feeling overwhelmed by nature. But at the same time, it celebrates this uniquely human imagination, our ability to comprehend and articulate through art, through film, our infinitesimally small place within the cosmos. And what you can do is track through this sublime disaster genre into filmic accounts of the Anthropocene, particularly within science fiction and horror. Now, science fiction, as Alexa gave that great introduction to, is a genre that produces, yes, these fictionalized dystopian, but also on occasion utopian framings around things like climate change. And the idea is that these are issues and problems generated and debated by contemporary scientific research. But as the great science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin emphasized, science fiction is by no means a prediction about the future. Rather, it's a thought experiment around the present. And so what I wanted to note is how in Anthropocene films, we see the reanimation of the sublime and the disastrous on several levels. And I wanted to show you two contrasting examples of Anthropocene disaster films. The first one is the big blockbuster, and that's Interstellar. And so the basic plot is that we're reaching the end of an habitable Earth, and we have the search for a new habitable planet B. And so we see all kinds of situations where humans are battling, not just against events on Earth, but events through the cosmos, on other planets, and so on. And what we see is the sublime at work. These cosmically insignificant human beings striving to survive. But compare that with a movie like Melancholia, Lars von Trier. We have the same end of the earth as this rogue planet Melancholia crashes into it. But as the critic Roger Ebert says, in any film involving the destruction of the globe, we know that if it's not to be saved, there must be a money shot depicting the actual cataclysm. And he doubts that any could do better than von Trier does here. There are no tidal waves, no animals fleeing, no skyscrapers falling, none of that easy stuff we become used to in the disaster movie. No, there's simply a character standing on a hill and staring straight at the impending doom, as von Trier shows it happening in what logically must be slow motion, with a fearsome preliminary merging of planetary atmospheres. And because it doesn't use those easy tropes of a disaster film, I think it does beg the question, well, how is it related to a disastrous Anthropocene? And it's because Melancholia tells us something about how people view themselves rather than the world. And it's arguably an examination of our loss of capacity to care. So here we see cosmically insignificant humans who don't care about surviving. Now, science fiction can and does embed horror elements, but horror is another extremely useful genre in and of itself to consider a catastrophic Anthropocene from. And horror, as with the sublime, it has to be said, is a conservative, very often xenophobic genre. It thrives on animating threats from over there, which threaten over here, and it prompts securitization. But it also strives to give a sense of the unimaginable, the unspeakable, and that which defies understanding. There's a great quote from Eugene Thacker from his book In the Dust of This Planet, where he talks about the need to turn towards horror as a way of grasping what's happening to us. And he says, the world is increasingly unthinkable, a world of planetary disasters, emerging pandemics, tectonic shifts, strange weather, oil-drenched landscapes, and the furtive, always looming threat of extinction. And to confront this idea is to confront an absolute limit to our ability to adequately understand the world at all, an idea that's been central to the horror genre for some time. So perhaps it's no wonder that we're seeing Anthropocene films such as this release in 2020, which bring the sublime to bear once more. But of course, now we have this cosmically insignificant girl, the protagonist of the film, traversing the new wastelands of the Anthropocene. So to sum up on the general theme of this webinar, which is film and disaster and the way films work as warning devices, what I really want to emphasize is, yes, our apprehensions of disaster are shaped by the sublime. I think it's incredibly pervasive, and I think it is fundamentally conservative. But there are other discourses also. These discourses, yes, are very much manifest in film, but also in factual text, such as government warnings. And so I just put in the little tsunami hazard warning, there, and the iconography, which again reanimates the sublime. And so the question, I think, for those interested in film and disaster is, well, how can a catastrophic Anthropocene be reworked in these genres of science fiction and horror, but also what new discourses can be brought to bear And I think that's why I was particularly interested in what Alexa was saying at the end about these utopian framing devices that are being brought forward. And really, what are the underlying discourses and aesthetics that are animating those? And that leads us on to ask, well, how can discourses other than the sublime animate our warnings? How can we get out of this box we've built for ourselves in associating extreme events and disaster with the sublime? And that's me done. Thank you.
Deborah, that was a really interesting and kind of different perspective on disasters and warnings. And we're going to take a quick 5-minute break now before we move on to John's presentation. And that'll make, we'll kind of meet back here at around just after 2. So welcome back, everyone. And now we're going to move on to John's presentation on the representations of warning technologies in recent disaster films.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you to the other 2 panelists. Excellent presentations, and very excited to be on the panel with both of you. I'm going to talk a little bit about more focused on disaster movies. So I teach emergency and disaster management, and one of my research areas is focused on looking at disaster films and the influence they have on the range of stakeholders, from individuals to first responders to key decision makers at a national level. The way that I got into this was a coping mechanism for the pandemic. Still working out if that was a good decision or not. But like many professors, our programming for school was moved online. I had a lot of time, and my research partner, Dr. Montano, and I decided that we were going to go through and watch all of the most popular disaster movies of the last 20 years. Whenever we talk about disaster movies, to set the specific definition, what we're looking at are movies that are tagged on the website IMDb as a disaster movie. This accomplished a couple things for us. One was that it's the public's definition. So whenever we're looking at how the public perceives disaster movies, we start with that definition that they themselves offer. And because that website uses those definitions, we started there. There's some other key things with our definition. If you're interested, you can check out the methodology on our article. But in general, it was that the disasters were the focus of the movie rather than happening in the background. We recognized as we went through a lot of these movies that even though they're designed for entertainment purposes, there's still education to be gained. And sometimes that is accurate, but many times it is not. Not just with the science of things, but also the ways that our government operates, the way that we receive warnings, the way that human behavior occurs in disasters. And so we looked at this and said, we really need to start diving into what these movies are sharing with people and how is this changing our perception. As individuals that present to different groups, a lot of times whenever we work with community organizations, we get questions that are contextualized in the format of a disaster movie. I saw this in the movie Twister, is this accurate? Or we are sharing information with the public and they connect it with their pre-existing narrative of, oh yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I saw that in the movie 2012. I understand now. It's not just the individuals in our community, though, that connect disaster movies in this way. There's been a number of different occasions where anecdotally, there's been evidence to suggest that disaster movies are shaping behavior within other groups of individuals. During the September 11th attacks in the United States, when boat captains would pull up to help with the waterborne evacuation, many would be shouting women and children first. And some disaster researchers tried to follow up on that and ask, why was that? This is not a maritime policy. This is not part of a training program. Where did this phrase come from? They continued to interview boat captains, and what they ended up finding was some of them said, you know, Titanic came out a couple of years before this event occurred. it's probably that we saw the movie Titanic and we thought that was the right thing to do in this situation. We're everyday boat captains. We don't do this stuff very often, so we're using that because we saw that in the movie. So it's possible that, or it's probable that many of those boat captains were shaping that response to the largest terrorist attack in U.S. history based on a disaster movie. More recently, we had individuals such as the former British Health Secretary Matt Hancock that were citing the movie Contagion as if it were a real case study from a foreign country. So if you watch the interviews, he's saying, we saw that this was the way that people behaved in Contagion, and we knew that we wanted to avoid that behavior, so we went with this strategy instead. So it's not just the everyday citizens, it is all the way across this range of stakeholders. The other important thing to note here is that these are individuals who are willing to come forward and say they were influenced by the film. There's likely many more who are not going to admit, I based the decisions of this entire country on a movie I watched a couple years ago. So it's possible that many more people are influenced in this way. And that's by design. These filmmakers, their goal is to start in the realm of fact, end in the realm of extreme fiction, and do a good job of covering up their tracks along the way so that you can't figure out where that threshold is between fact and fiction. And that's, if you read into the film studies literature, that's the mark of a good filmmaker. If they can hook you all the way through that movie to the point that you're bought into even the most extreme situation that they offer at the end of the film. So as an example of how this can muddle our understanding and how it can confuse individuals, we take a movie like The Core, an excellent movie, one of my favorites, and it starts with the assumption that the viewers know basic Earth science. Your grade school education that the Earth has layers and that the layers act in different ways, that's the starting point for these films. Then we move into the idea that these different layers are made of different materials, and those materials act differently under different conditions. And then fast forward to somewhere towards the end of the movie, we are with the main characters in a dirt submarine that is traveling through the Earth's core, and it's powered by a laser, and we're cutting through rock, and there's all kinds of bizarre stuff that's happening. And we're somewhere in the middle, from Earth science to dirt submarine, we've gone into extreme fiction. There was some research that was done with a group of grade 6th, 7th, and 8th graders where they were in a Earth science class that had been learning about Earth science for 8 weeks. After that 8-week period of learning about the Earth's core and other similar topics, they ended up watching The Core, and according to the pre-test and post-test, just that one time watching through The Core was enough to muddle their understanding of Earth science up to that point. So that's happening with a group of students that are in a class focused on Earth science. What does that mean for adults that are learning about science and maybe aren't engaged in active education at that moment? Switching gears a little bit to talking about disaster warnings specifically. Whenever I discuss warnings, I'm talking about the communications meant to inform individuals of hazards and yield protective actions. These could include anything from the notifications you get on your phone, text messages, calls from loved ones that are worried about you, news media, social media apps, just this broad range of warnings. One thing that's kind of funny whenever this is the topic of my discussion, these types of warnings aren't regularly featured in many of these films outside of interpersonal communications. There's a lot of news media that's happening in the background, but most of that is meant to provide you, the viewer, with plot points of, oh, this hurricane or this volcano is really bad. We really need to be worried about this. And in many shots, it shows the main character grabbing their keys and heading out the door while they're missing the warning in the background. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact and fiction related to warnings and human behavior in many of these disaster movies. One of the biggest things that we know is that when it comes to the way that we receive warnings, our social networks and social milling, as we call it, have a significant role in us receiving those warnings. Dr. Dennis Milletti has a great quote where he said, "Modern warning technologies are fast, but mama's faster." And what he means by that is it's likely that we receive a number of different warnings from different mediums, our cell phone, television, but the warning that we act on first, and sometimes the warning that we receive first, is those warnings that are coming from our social network. from our friends, coworkers, our loved ones that are calling us to check in. I heard there was going to be this event in your area. Are you doing okay? And that's something that we see in most of these disaster movies. And in fact, that happens. The top right image here is a meteorologist in the United States that he was in the middle of issuing a tornado warning, and he realized his kids were in the basement, or kids were in their bedroom playing video games. He stopped what he was doing, he called them up on the phone, and they had not received that warning yet. Even though, you know, they're in a family where this is kind of the stuff that they talk about, that phone call made the difference, making sure those kids were safe in that scenario. We also do social milling, so we observe others. We look to see, should I be packing up? Are my neighbors packing up? Is everybody evacuating? And then the bottom shot here is looking at the movie Greenland, where we're looking at environmental cues. Is there different behavior that's happening? Are government agencies doing something different? Do we see a movement of resources? There's a great case study of the Orville Dam in California, where the residents that were in danger, they observed some of that activity where they saw government vehicles moving, they saw individuals inspecting a dam, and they got queued up that something may be happening before that warning was issued. So we look at those types of environmental cues. Another fact that we see is that our warnings are not 100% effective, but we are improving on that. There's a lot of limiting factors. Some of the biggest ones are access to technology. It may not necessarily be that you can't afford a cell phone, but maybe you have a cell phone, but you're in a rural area with poor reception. In diverse areas like London, you have language barriers where there's either residents or tourists that may not receive the message because they don't speak the language that the warning is issued in. And then, of course, there's individuals that we warn and either they don't listen or they don't want to take action. We see this a lot. It's almost a standard trope in disaster movies where there's one character that needs rescued because they've refused to listen to the warnings up to this point. This is Dante's Peak, and the grandma is saying, I've lived here on this mountain my whole life. I don't care if it's going to blow. I'm staying right here, and they have to go rescue grandma. We also have individuals that are not wanting to override their norms of their regular life because they don't feel like the disaster or the hazard event is serious enough. The bottom movie is Shin Godzilla, which I'll talk about in a second. And the monster is on the other side of the city, but it's not affecting me yet. So I'm going to keep going for my morning walk, my morning run. Another thing we see with facts in the movies, even though it is a dramatic process, is that there are process delays within our warning systems. And what we mean by that is we don't want, the natural instinct is to avoid our warning systems being too reactive and risk the possibility that we jump the gun and issue a warning way before we should, or in a situation where it's not warranted yet. So we put bureaucracy in there as a remedy to prevent that reactive behavior. One of the best movies that shows this is the movie Shin Godzilla. Arguably, this is one of the most accurate movies when it comes to disaster management because it shows the bureaucracy of what's going on. Half the movie takes place in conference rooms and the emergency operations center and different chambers where it shows how many different stakeholders have to come together to agree on what the experts see as a relatively simple solution. And so what we see here is we're going through and trying to figure out, is this worth it? On the bottom right, we also see one of the other dramatic tropes, that is, should I press the button? Am I going to warn people? Am I going to evacuate people? Whatever that button may mean. But that's not just in the movies, but that's a real world situation that individuals issuing evacuation orders and warnings have to deal with. These individuals are asking themselves, you know, if we're wrong, if we issue this and we have to walk it back, we're going to lose credibility as an agency. For me as an individual and as a professional, I'm going to lose credibility because I made this mistake. We could cause our entire city or region-wide response that may cause a lot of panic or you know, may hurt some people that shouldn't be moved unless it's absolutely necessary. And of course, I may lose my job. If I mess up, my job's on the line. We see that in the movies a lot of times. This image is from The Wave, a Norwegian disaster film, which is exceptional. I highly recommend it. And so that gives you a good idea of what we see with some of these practitioners. And of course, including the individuals on this panel, there are experts that are working on improving our timing and accuracy. The fiction here is, if you watch a movie like San Andreas, especially with earthquake movies, the plot is we figured out how to predict these earthquakes. And so now we know ahead of time when earthquakes are going to happen. We're not there yet, we're working on that, but we're really good at measuring conditions and likelihood, and we know when something is possible. We just can't time it down to the minute where that's going to happen. And as you've heard with some of the other panelists today, these movies offer an allegory for real world disasters. So whenever individuals lack information on something they're familiar with, like disasters, they fill that gap with information that's accessible, such as disaster movies. The challenge is that these disaster movies may not be representative of the reality that they're trying to understand. So just some fictions behind warnings in these movies. One of the biggest things is if you were to read through or watch through all of these movies from the last 20 years, the things that come up most are asteroids and solar weather. And so it gives you the impression that these are the things that we need to be worried about. And what I mean by asteroids and solar weather are asteroids, meteorites, comets, solar flares, etc. Out of the 173 movies that Dr. Montano and I went through for the research that we did, 30 of those movies were from these space events that were impacting Earth. In contrast, movies about wildfires, for example, in the United States, wildfires are one of our biggest concerns. There's only one movie in the last 20 years, Only the Brave, that was about wildfires. Also, there were only 2 movies about floods. There was only 1 movie about sea level rise, and there was only 9 movies about hurricanes. So we're talking about a very, very small number of movies representing what is arguably the biggest dangers that we face in the United States, at least. But we have many more movies about asteroids and comets. For example, Don't Look Up. It could be that the hazard events of floods and sea level rise are just not as exciting enough. Don't Look Up is about climate change and about sea level rise and all of these things, but that wasn't exciting enough, so we're going to put a comet in there instead. And that's more exciting, that's more dramatic. So it's possible that that's the case, although that does mislead us in what is most dangerous. We become more concerned about a comet versus climate change. And of course, one of the biggest things that we see as disaster researchers is that at the end of these movies, the movie is focused largely on response. And whenever the movie wraps up, as Alexa was saying, the positive payoff emotions, we have to uplift that viewer on the way out. So we say, well, everything's great. The inside joke for a lot of our researchers in this field is, and now we rebuild, this dramatic quote from Dwayne Johnson in San Andreas. The effect is, it's great that we are leaving the theater in an uplifting way. If you watch a movie like Only the Brave, it would be really rough to leave the theater after watching the deaths of 20 or so firefighters. That's a pretty low point to walk out of the theater on. However, it gives the impression that for recovery is simple. Recovery happens quickly, when most disaster researchers are well aware that recovery takes years, if not decades, to come back from something. It's not just getting the power back on, it is the economic recovery, the emotional recovery, the environmental recovery in some cases. It's much bigger than what these movies make it out to be. And when you shrink that down to a matter of a minute or two, montage at the end for a feel-good moment, that may reshape the understanding of individuals on how simple that recovery process is. So what are people learning from movies, and what are people taking away? The important thing to note here is that the science communication literature on this is pretty limited. There are a lot of studies on what Alexa was talking about with the environmental documentaries, the effect they have on our perception of risk and concern and things like that. However, on fictional movies, since fictional movies are not designed to be educational, there hasn't been a lot of research on that topic specifically. There's been a couple like The Day After Tomorrow, where they have measured people's concern for climate change, but that's about the extent of it. There's not much research beyond that. What these movies are depicting may skew the perception of individuals. For example, it skews the view of disasters in the pace and activities. So as I mentioned, if recovery isn't featured, then people may not be aware of the challenges that that takes. Or for us in the United States, a common trope in our American disaster movies is featuring our Federal Emergency Management Agency. They feature them because it looks cool. You've got a neat badge that has good iconography, that this is an official person that knows what they're talking about. The top picture is from Greenland. The bottom one is from Contagion, and it gives some good iconography that looks neat. However, that may change our perception of what things agencies do. So in Contagion, for example, FEMA is handing out food rations and water bottles, which is something that more than likely a nonprofit or the National Guard or another group is going to do. And so it may be that that's changing our perception of what our federal agency does. Focusing back in on our warning processes, this may also be changing the way that individuals are expecting warnings to come across. It's managing their expectation in a different way. If you watch the movie Greenland, the main character, whenever the event starts happening, he receives a phone call, a text message, a personalized message across a smart TV, and those repeat until he has responded to the message from the federal government. That is a lot of messages that are coming through, and that's probably not realistic compared to what would actually happen, which would be phone notifications and a few other things. So this may be managing expectations in a different direction. So what can we do to improve some of these warnings? Well, on a micro level, we can work to inform and practice warning systems within communities. That's a standard practice that we can ramp up, and we can make sure to try and make sure individuals have managed expectations in the right way of what to see. We can also work to, at a broad level, build the public's understanding of the realities of disaster. And I think that's a challenge that many of us in higher education and university work have as part of our mission, is to make sure people are aware of the things that are going on in our field. We can highlight stories that show the reality of disasters. If we look at long-term recovery in the news media, there's really not a lot of feature on those, with the exception of a 1-year, 5-year, 10-year anniversary. There's not a lot of discussion about how grueling and arduous that recovery process is for the individuals that are enduring it. Ideally, our result is that we have a better understanding for those citizens, and that we can build up that self-efficacy and that resilience. If you liked some of the things that I talked about, some of the places that I would recommend going to, Dr. Dennis Milletti, that I referenced a couple times, he has an exceptional talk that was put on by FEMA. They're called Prep Talks. You can go and watch that. It's about a 15-minute, I think, film that talks about modern warning technologies. You can also look up the research that Dr. Montano and I did. And if you want to know more about science and how it's misrepresented in Hollywood, you can look up Lab Coats in Hollywood by David Kirby, which talks about science at a broad level, not just what we're talking about with disasters, but the discipline of science in general. And then there, of course, is my contact information.
Thanks so much, John. That was really interesting. And also, I highly recommend checking out John's episode of the podcast Disaster Girls. It's really, really interesting. So we're going to move on to the Q&A now. So please, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, just pop them in the chat and we'll read them out. So I'm going to just kind of begin with my own question, just kind of general question to you all. But why do you think that disaster movies have retained this popularity over the years, and why do we keep kind of coming back for more?
John, maybe do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. You know, one thing that if you look through a lot of the film scholar work here, they would say that film is the way that we process things we can't process in person. And with disasters specifically, it's a topic where it is unsafe for us to go and experience it in person. And so if we don't want to go to Chernobyl and do a response in unsafe conditions, we can watch it on the HBO miniseries. There's some research with neurobiology to suggest that that allows us to experience the same brain chemistry of that situation, the same emotional response, the same sense of danger, and we seek that out the same way we do roller coasters at theme parks. So that's one way. Another way that the Disaster Girls podcast actually talks about is kind of our modern version of creation and doomsday myths, that our mythology behind things. We've moved to a different type of sociology behind it, where, like we mentioned in a couple different layers, this is our ability to connect the creative, the philosophical, the spiritual into this. We don't really think about that when you watch something like The Day After Tomorrow, but whenever people leave that situation considering what's my role in this, what's going to happen if, that's some of the ways that we process this is by going through these creative pieces, especially with a movie like Don't Look Up, where you have a political issue that's happening. This is a way for individuals to process it in a different way. Looking back to something like the Godzilla franchise, the Godzilla franchise is based on the idea that we are trying to recover from nuclear fallout. How do we do that? We're going to do that with an art form. We can't actively criticize certain government groups, but we're going to turn those certain government groups into a giant monster that's attacked our community, and that's how we're going to process that. And so there's a couple different ways that that we make meaning of situations through these movies, and that's probably why they've been so popular through different areas.
Yeah, I would second that. Since I'm in my research, I work a lot with the neuroscience that you mentioned with those insights from cognitive psychology. And yeah, I mean, you're along there for the ride. I think that's really important. And it's an emotional experience. It's a sensual experience, right? You literally, your heart rate goes up and you have physical reactions to these movies. And I think, I mean, this is true for all action movies. It's not just a disaster movie, but they kind of check all the boxes of having these stunning visuals and special effects and a lot of movement. When we watch movement, we are experiencing that movement ourselves. So I think that's part of it. And then of course you could also make these other arguments on a philosophical level, but as John already did, what's happening there. And maybe one that we could also add is the genre conventions, which that you have, that usually is a happy ending at the end, and that, which is why I think that Don't Look Up is such an interesting movie. I really do think that, because when I watched it, I couldn't believe it was getting closer and closer and closer to the end. I was like, okay, so how are they gonna turn this around now? And then they don't. It's and I found that truly interesting. For me, it makes the film really special. It makes it unusual in that sense. Yeah.
I'll just add one thing very quickly, and that is that there is research on the sort of popularity and decline of various film genres. And so, for example, the Western is declined, conspiracy theory films are on the up, etc. And you can try and correlate those with, how present particular issues are within popular culture more broadly. But underneath all of this, certain kinds of films are funded because they're seen as being able to make money. Yeah. And so we come back to the disaster film as being seen as a sort of tried and tested narrative that can create a blockbuster that can be disseminated through various kinds of media. So in cinemas, but then also onto Netflix and so forth. And they're seen as being profitable. In terms of how they're actually received, of course, it's very interesting. Because yes, we have, the way in which we become emotionally involved, but also there's unexpected engagements. For example, the ironic reception of the disaster film, is not something to be, underestimated. So that's my one additional comment is the money.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. And something that John also pointed out earlier, I thought it was so interesting when you looked at the most likely disasters we are going to be exposed to according to the history of disaster film, and how that was not really the ones that we are supposed to be dealing with, and that may not be a coincidence, right? Because if you develop the dystopian stories and they're too close to home, I mean, I guess there are interesting examples with, for example, the pandemic and Contagion suddenly being a film that people wanted to see, but very often the producers, the people give you the money, they will be concerned that people may not be too keen on seeing a film about something that they're truly worried about. Yeah. So I think that can go both ways. So I mean, Don't Look Up is about climate change. A lot of people argue, including the director, but then it's not about climate change, right?
Yeah, and that's something that with wildfires, for example, we have significant portions of the United States that either are at current risk or have recently experienced a wildfire. That may be a good reason for explaining why somebody wouldn't fund that film. In contrast, even though there's been one wildfire movie, there's been 5 Sharknado films. So that's something where we look at what's going to make money and what's going to be popular. That's a good way of explaining that.
I'm just going to say I really enjoy the Sharknado films. So.
I wasn't knocking on the Sharknado film.
That's great, thanks. I've got a question I think is directed at Deborah, and it's someone asking if you would be able to clarify the context of the use of the word sublime in terms of disasters.
Well, the sublime is one of those sort of aesthetic framings, way of thinking and feeling, engaging in the world that has such a complicated history. I mean, I pulled out literally 3 commentators on it, and you can take the sublime back centuries, and you can see how the sublime intersects with other ways of, framing the world, like the Gothic, for example. So it's something that very much predates the disaster film. But I think it's something which has become a crucial resource for the disaster film. So there's no sort of easy way to say that, this particular concept has these sort of boundaries around it. It works this way axiomatically, and it's linked to this in this way. Once you start talking about discourse, it's so slippery. You're looking at intimations and echoes and reiterations, and you try to bring to bear a very different language in articulating that. But but it may be useful to point out then that the disaster film does not need to reflect back on the sublime. At its heart, the sublime, what it does is separate humanity from the environment. It's not the only discourse which does this, but it's a key discourse which does this. And a disaster film does not need to do that. A disaster film can be something like Erin Brockovich. It can be about slow violence, which is embedded in the flesh. So, there's no intrinsic separation, where we're confronted by nature. We are fundamentally part of that nature, and we are transforming nature, and it has impacts on us as earthly creatures. So I don't think that gives a very quick, clean answer, but I think it might be the best I can do.
That makes sense.
But you're very kind, Maddie.
So I've got a question for everyone here again, and it's how do we know if fictional depictions of warnings and public reaction translates into real life understanding of hazard warnings?
So if we're looking at the hazard science piece of this, one thing that a lot of the literature looks at is how long the movie has an impact on individuals. And for some of the ones related to risk perception and fear of the climate, the impact is only a couple weeks long before it returns back to the pre-film levels of wherever the person was at. In some of the studies, it talks about how the the level of knowledge has increased after film, such as The Inconvenient Truth, what we saw is that the film led to knowledge-seeking activity for those individuals. They sought out more information. They wanted to better understand the concepts that they were presented. And it was likely because of the constructive way that that film was developed, where you can take action, you can do something about this. Whenever it comes to some of the bigger topics within these films, the challenge that we have is looking at how we can increase knowledge through them. And if you look at films like Don't Look Up, what we see is that they can also be what's known as event films, where it is not, the greatest sharing of knowledge is not from the film itself, but it is the discussion with panels like this, with news media, social media that are surrounding it. If you watched Don't Look Up, there were hundreds of different experts that were saying, here's my specific take on it. As an anthropologist, as a sociologist, as a climate scientist. And it's highly likely that if individuals were learning things, it was from that surrounding aura of knowledge around the movie, not the movie itself. Because again, the movie was supposedly about climate change, but did not address climate change whatsoever. But it developed this huge culture of people wanting to know more, radio stories, BBC, NPR, all of these groups doing that. And so it's likely that that activity around it can increase our understanding, not just with disasters, but with warnings.
It's the same for The Day After Tomorrow. I mean,
Yes.
Lazarevitz has written about that, right? How the media impact was so enormous around that film, to the degree that the Bush administration tried to muzzle NASA commenting on it, and then they did anyway. And almost every like climate change, a research center had something on their website commenting on the film, on the inaccuracies and all that. So it was just a huge echo in the media, and also scientists commenting on the film. So Lazarevitz attributes a lot of the influence of the film, precisely as you point out, for Don't Look Up, to the larger debate, the larger discussion around such a film.
There's another question as well, but yeah, so someone's asking if in your research, did you find any representation of those who receive warnings and choose to stay or ignore them? And what can be changed about the messaging or the response phase to get people out of harm's way despite the resistance? So I feel like that's more aimed at John.
Yeah, so that's one that, the work of this center and the work of some of those researchers really focuses on how do we reach those individuals. Some of the best practices that we've seen, one is the empathy that we've talked about during the earlier ones, where if an individual recognizes, a loved one calling somebody else and saying, I'm worried about you. I'm worried about my mother, my, whoever that person is to the person concerned. That's one way we can do it. There's also the idea of addressing if it's risk perception, where the person does not feel that this situation is of a particular risk. So with hurricanes in the United States, we see this pretty frequently, where an individual, I've survived 20 hurricanes, this is just going to be another one for me. Why is this a big concern? This isn't going to be any different than the last couple that I've survived. And with that one, we have to override that normalcy bias of, this is why this one is different. The ones you've survived, they came ashore as tropical storms. This one's a category 3. This is something you should be concerned about, and trying to work on overriding that. It's difficult to paint with a broad brush on how we change that behavior, because there's 5 or 6 different modalities of why people are not moving, but addressing the reason why they're not moving and trying to figure out how to counteract that is really the starting point for it.
I mean, it's really interesting because I don't really know much about actual warning systems and how they act. So it's just really interesting hearing you talk about it. And I want to ask a more kind of broad question, just because I'm curious about it. What is your guys' favourite disaster film? If anyone wants to begin.
That's a hard one.
Say that again, Deborah.
I was going to say that's a really hard one to come up with.
I've got kind of my top 5 because it's really difficult after you've watched 173. But the 2 that are from Norway, the Wave and the Quake, are exceptional, not just because of the way that they depict disasters, the science of it, but also because with the Wave, at least, they start off by saying that this is a persistent issue in Norway. And this is something that can happen, that will happen again, and frames it in that manner. So I think that's a really, really interesting couple to watch. Only the Brave is another one that is my personal favorite, just because of how emotional that movie is, and how on a broader level, it's kind of a memorial of the work that those individuals were doing whenever they lost their lives. The short version of that film is a serious wildfire in the United States that ended up killing a significant number of wildland firefighters. Besides that, Shin Godzilla is a little bit more campy and goofy, and I really enjoy it, especially for individuals interested in foreign films. It's a really good representation of emergency management and some of the things that we are trying to work with.
Alexa, do you want to go next? Because I actually have one now. After some deep thought.
So I think you asked this question why we shouldn't focus on the best practice. Is that, did I see that right? Let me see who asked this question. Yeah, like is that focus on the warnings? Is that the best idea? So we have been talking a lot about disaster films now, but then the question for me is really, is that the best genre? Because I have looked at disaster films, but I've also looked at many other environmental, both fiction and non-fiction films. And Deborah, you mentioned Erin Brockovich earlier as a disaster film, which I thought was great. Because of course this is not a genre disaster film at all. It works on a totally different register, and yet you're totally right. Of course it is about an environmental disaster, and I think that's really, really interesting if we look at the different ways in which this can be narrated, because Erin Brockovich, I would think, is an excellent film about an environmental disaster and about what people do. It's not so much about warnings in that sense, although it can certainly be understood. So if you watch that film, and you live in a community, you may start thinking totally differently about your surroundings. But I thought that was a really interesting film to bring up in that context. And there are more films like that focus on environmental injustice and slow violence, as you pointed out. And I think we should also not forget those films that are not genre disaster films.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's easy to think about those disaster films which revolve around extreme events and which try to show you this sort of speeded up time frame. And perhaps it is more challenging to think about the slow violence of environmental pollution and represent that sort of time frame within a filmic medium. I'm just going to say quickly, I think my favorite is actually the Poseidon Adventure, which is going back quite some time to the more innocent naive early days of the disaster film. And yes, there's a dramatic event, but that really isn't the focus. It's all about the characters and the different responses to the event that those characters display, and the different capacities and strengths that those characters have in many ways. And so that is one of my favorites. But after saying that, I just wanted to pick up on something that Gumbo put into the chat, which led me to think about, the fact that really when we talk about warnings, we're dealing with our plan B. Why are we even talking about warnings? Because we don't carry out a plan A, which is best practice living with a volatile Earth in a precautionary way. So if we're not doing that, then we're in plan B, where we have to warn, communities who are made vulnerable about these events, which may or may not impact them in this urgent way. And so, you know, I'm not saying we don't have something like the Warning Research Center, which I think is absolutely crucial, but I think it does help now and again to step back and think, why are we even talking about warnings and what warnings should do and how they should work? What else should we be thinking about? And I think the Warning Research Center does this very, very well, particularly its links with the other research centers at UCL. And that is, you know, what more positive, constructive, hopeful ways, you know, do we have to engage with, you know, living with each other and living on this volatile earth? And what precautions do we need to bring in before disasters emerge? So just thank you to Gumbo for sort of bringing that up.
Well, and I think the two documentaries that I mentioned that towards the end of my talk, so Tomorrow and 2040, they try to do that. You know, they are still working as a warning, but they're trying to show us the, you know, what you call the plan A. They show us to how could we, you know, in relation to climate change and biodiversity and a bunch of other things that are all interconnected, how could we live in a better way? And they're not only interested in kind of utopian dreaming, but both films look at actually already existing projects, and then they think about, if you extrapolate that into the future, you know, what would that future look like? How can already existing initiatives and community projects, like, you know, if you scale those up, what kind of future would we have then? And they combine that with a warning. And I think that's also an interesting way of doing that, because a complaint has often been, at least with documentary films, that, you know, you shouldn't make people afraid, and then, because that's a difference between nonfiction and fiction. In fiction, it's all okay to do that. But in nonfiction, if you make people really afraid and or angry, and then there's no solution, then the fear is always that they're going to disengage because it's too terrible to, you know, to hold those emotions for a long time. And so I think it's interesting that these films are trying to combine their warnings with more hopeful and, you know, positive visions of the future. So I think that's a very interesting recent development.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, but it's, do you think aesthetics and storytelling are important and significant in this type of communication, as films that depict kind of sublime doom and gloom of disasters?
Yes, because that's what communication is. It's all about aesthetics and storytelling.
I don't know if anyone else has any follow-up comments, or should we wrap it up?
We absolutely back that up. At least, yes.
Okay, so thanks for taking part in the panel, and thanks to everyone who asked questions. So I'm just going to pass along to Carina now to just kind of wrap up the webinar.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you for such an amazing webinar today. It's been really, really interesting, and I'm sure the beginning of a lot of great discussion that we can have. Today we've gone from Kant to David Attenborough to Al Gore to Jennifer Lawrence. So, and we hope that the reflections that you have from today's session will last beyond the day after tomorrow. Sorry for the terrible joke there. So yeah, we have had some great insights today, and it's really kind of struck me that sadly we don't have disaster movies that end with the disaster averted due to excellent preparedness and action, which of course is the goal of, I think, most disaster workers and practitioners. That's really what we're pushing for, is that the disaster doesn't happen at all. But of course that is not human nature and hasn't been in the past, but that's something we've got to work on. And of course that wouldn't make a very interesting movie either. But, you know, just to run through, to summarize some of the points we've talked about today. So Alexa has highlighted the role of warnings in disaster movies as part of our cultural references and the value that has, and that, you know, they're often designed to entertain us, and we have to remember that they're not there to necessarily scientifically represent us. I'll come back to that in a bit. And they're frequently messages of doom and blood and all sorts of gloom, but usually have some element of resolution in it. But she also highlighted this growing movement of different narratives that are positive, focusing on solutions and hope that we can do something to inspire. As she mentioned, the 2014 movie by Damon Gamu stated, we don't have to watch blind into the future. And I think that's a really important point, is that actually, sci-fi has often been used as a way to imagine what futures might be or how alternatives of our life might be. And I think more so than ever, we need that in a positive way to look at how and how we could get ourselves out of the mess that we've made for ourselves, but also prepare for those very high risk impacts that may happen either frequently or infrequently. And Deborah picked up on this point by focusing on how the sublime has pervaded much of the representation of disaster and sci-fi, and has also asked how different discourses and genres could be used to spin this narrative from being a passive recipient of a disaster, and how disasters can be brought into bear, how we can actually be proactive in all of this, and in a way recognizing that we are part of nature, not distinct from it, and we need to understand those relationships much better. And of course, the Anthropocene is a good example of bringing that out. And then John highlighted the need to focus on the reality of disasters and representing the long-term issues from disasters that are often glossed over. And I think if people realised, that it would take a decade to rebuild Christchurch, a city in New Zealand, which is not a good example because they were as prepared as they could have been. But that potential impact does make you rethink perhaps how you might want to prepare for a disaster or a particular hazard. And of course, this involves a lot of work on the public understanding of warnings, and a need to work on both local and global communities to make sure warnings are better understood. But also John highlighted that actually warnings can be very well represented in movies in terms of the issues around credibility, communication, false alarms, and so on. And actually, so it seems that in a way, warnings are quite accurately represented in many films and documentaries, bizarrely, but necessarily the hazard or the threat isn't. So it's kind of quite interesting there. And it's, I guess, an interesting question is to look at how that then feeds through to how we might think about warnings and how the public understanding of warnings is, and whether that knowledge translates from movies in the same way that it does about the hazard when they might get a warning out of the blue. So it's really, in summary, it sort of remains clear that there's definitely a gap between science and art and entertainment, and that remains a large gap, particularly in relation to the goals of each of those different groups. And there's a real challenge with melding reality of made up material with reality. And this doesn't help generally in terms of science communication. And so you could ask, how could we do better at getting better science and representation in movies or even in documentaries? And maybe the answer is not to do that. I don't know. But it's clear from all three speakers there's a need for a change of discourse of hope and fear, inspiration, doom, and control and horror. And there are also questions about how we can continue to convey warnings better and generate better understandings and action to warnings, which of course is the very core and focus of Don't Look Up, which is we need to respond to warnings, because if you don't respond or you wait until you can see it, quite often it's too late. And of course that requires a trust issue by the public and authorities. And that is quite often a challenge in the real world, as we know. So communication and entertainment clearly has a number of challenges that are both similar and different all across the world. And of course, we have a lot of international learning and exchange to do between different cultures and groups. And the WC, we hope, is ideally placed to bring those together and learn from each other, especially artists and scientists and entertainers together. So thank you very much for today. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope this is the beginning of a discussion that will continue. So please do contact us if you have an interest in carrying on the discussion. As I stated before, this event is recorded and will be placed on our YouTube channel. The link has been put into the chat of the Zoom there, and we hope to see you at future warning research events. Thanks again to our wonderful three guest speakers today, our host, Maddie, and also the team in the background, Ilan Kelman, who's been helping on the technological side. So thank you very much, everyone, for such a wonderful afternoon.